the last Australian First Nations Prime Minister that you can think of? No one, right? Okay, well, how about the US? Who was the last Native American president that they had? No one. Canada, New Zealand, all of these first world countries, these highly developed nations, and none of them have ever had an Indigenous president or prime minister. Hopefully, this allows you to understand the importance of this man, Pedro Castillo, Peru's first ever First Nations president. Castillo represented a left-wing party called Free Peru, as well as being an advocate for several unions. Previously a rural school teacher, Castillo's attempts to make his country a better place were met with nothing but scorn and disregard from his peers in government and representatives of the media. Recently, Castillo was completely unfairly ousted from office and arrested. Of course, following this, many people began to protest and riot for their elected president and against the right-wing vice president who took power shortly after him. The resulting media coverage, particularly from places like CNN and Al Jazeera, has been nothing short of disrespectful, undermining the importance of having a First Nations president, minimizing public support of the protests, and refusing to acknowledge governmental and police blame for the events that transpired. The unfair media coverage of these events and these protests demonstrate the implicit bias against First Nations people and perpetuates the harmful stereotypes and systemic neglect that makes Peru's Indigenous people vulnerable. One of the most obvious demonstrations of media bias throughout the articles is how the achievement of being Peru's first ever Indigenous leader is minimized and undermined. For example, the media bias technique of slant is clearly used by Al Jazeera when they introduce Castillo by mentioning that he has only recently joined his political party. Leaving out Castillo's extensive involvement with union work is an interesting choice for the journalist to make, but it easily sets the tone for what continues to be a deliberately misleading article. By making Castillo seem inexperienced, the author is trying to convince the audience that he was a bad fit for president in the first place, and that what happened to Castillo was just. Al Jazeera continues this pattern, following up in a later paragraph that it is no exaggeration to say that Castillo's time in office was disastrous. The extremely obvious use of sensationalist language reinforces the unprofessionalism shown in the writing of the article. Both pieces of evidence work together to make Castillo seem like a fool who had no idea what he was doing. By portraying Peru's first Indigenous leader as inept, it plants the idea in the public's mind that it was a mistake to elect him, or that he deserved the presidency less than his non-Indigenous political opponents. This kind of thinking is extremely harmful, not just to Castillo, but to all Indigenous Peruvian people. How do you think the Australian public would react if we had our first ever Aboriginal Prime Minister, and all of the news articles about them were focused on all of their mistakes? First Nations people already struggle against harmful stereotypes. There is no way that this unfair depiction of Castillo wouldn't have severely negative impacts on Indigenous people all around the country. The phrasing draws on the audience's sense of patriotism. They encourage to look at their homes, look at where they live, and consider how this would never happen in their country, in a country where a First Nations person has never held office. The subtle bias implies to the audience that First Nations people are not fit for positions like president or prime minister, and is harmful not only to Peruvian people, but to Indigenous communities all around the world. Another demonstration of media bias is the presentation of public response. CNN has many quotes from citizens in their article, including one from Alex Mendoza, a taxi driver in Lima. "If protests start again, we would not be able to work to provide for our family," Mendoza is quoted as saying. Interestingly enough, despite all the different people interviewed for this article, not one of them was a supporter of Castillo. This bias by omission leads the audience to falsely believe that the general public is largely dismissive of these protests, when that is not at all the case. This is seen again later in the article, when an image is shown of a lone protester facing a large group of police officers, as seen on the screen. The officers stand in the middle and back of the frame with their guns down and no indication of attacking. The protester, however, holds his arm out in a provocative stance and looks ready to fight. Both the framing and the contents of this photo are deliberately misleading in how they present the situation to the audience. Firstly, it implies that there were very few protesters, and secondly, it makes the protesters that were there seem violent and irrational compared to the calm police. This wasn't at all the case. In fact, far more protesters were killed by police than police were killed at all during the riots and protests. However, by deliberately omitting important details or points of view, CNN's article misleads readers to convince them that the national upset in Peru is minimal, and that the actions of police towards protesters is in any way excusable. The implication that the general public isn't only dismissive of the protest, but outright offended by them, does nothing but discredit the protesters. It appeals to the value of community that many Australians hold so dear, and make the protesters seem like uncaring, callous people who are indifferent to the upset of their neighbours. While the government cries for help over a problem they've created, Indigenous people and their many allies are standing hand in hand with the public to help the fight for justice. The actions of the police and government in dealing with the protesters has also been grossly misrepresented. While discussing the deaths of the Peruvian protests, the CNN article specifically mentions the death of a police officer and not of any protesters. Once again, this bias by omission makes it seem as though the police are dealing with the situation peacefully and merely being caught in the crossfire, when in reality, the protesters are being murdered by police. The article also includes an image of a group of protesters outside Peru's governing house, with small memorial sites set up for protesters that have been killed. The protesters are being left alone, despite the police car clearly in view behind them. With the protesters directly outside the governing house and in front of a police car, the protests begin to look more like an unfortunate series of events rather than a horrific and planned massacre of Indigenous and lower-class people by the government and police force. This section of the article takes advantage of the reader's sense of safety by making the police and government seem non-threatening. It undermines the importance of the protesters by making the protesters seem unreliable. Not only does this misconception harm Peruvian First Nations people, as it makes all the cruelty they face at the hands of the government seem minimal, but it also harms Indigenous people all around the world. Even right here in our very own backyard, Torres Strait Islander and Aboriginal people face an overwhelmingly unfair amount of prejudice emanating from our government and police force. It's articles and writers like this that stop First Nations people from getting the fair treatment and justice that they deserve. The treatment of Peru's First Nations people during this entire ordeal has been nothing short of inhumane, but unfortunately, this is not atypical or unheard of. The next time you read a news article, I implore you, please consider everything that is being shown and presented to you. Accepting these articles as unquestionable fact does nothing but hurt people, further push harmful stereotypes, and allow injustice to prevail.